December 1944. German armor poured through the Ardennes in the largest offensive Hitler had launched since D-Day. 25 divisions, 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks drove through frozen forest roads and collapsed the American line across a 60-mile front. Deep inside Belgium, in the small crossroads town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. 7 roads converged at that junction. Whoever held Bastogne controlled movement through the southern Ardennes. The Germans needed it. The Americans were running out of ammunition, food, and time. The German calculation was straightforward and seemingly sound. No Allied force could disengage from active combat, pivot 90 degrees in winter conditions, and launch a counterattack in under a week. The roads were frozen. The forest was dense. The weather had grounded Allied air support. Bastogne would fall. The road to Antwerp would open. And the Allied coalition would fracture under the pressure of its greatest crisis in the West. What the Germans had not accounted for was that one American general had already started moving before anyone had asked him to. The name on every serious German intelligence assessment by late 1944 was George S. Patton. Not because the Germans had tracked him with obsessive fear from the beginning. The historical record does not support that claim. For much of the war, German intelligence barely noticed him. But by the time the Ardennes offensive began, the German high command had learned, battle by battle, that Patton operated by a logic no other Allied commander seemed to share. He did not wait for the enemy to commit. He committed first. He did not prepare for battles as they unfolded. He prepared for battles that had not yet been announced. And in the months since his Third Army had poured out of Normandy, he had moved further, faster, and more dangerously than any opposing commander had believed possible. This is the story of 5 moves, across 2 theaters, 2 years, and several hundred miles of European terrain, that earned Patton the one thing that outlasted the war: the documented respect of the men who tried to stop him. The first came in the summer of 1943, on a triangular island at the center of the Mediterranean. The Allied plan for Sicily assigned Patton's 7th Army a supporting role, while General Montgomery's British 8th Army made the main thrust up the eastern coast toward the port of Messina. Patton's forces were to land on the southwestern beaches along the Gulf of Gela and protect the British left flank. On paper, it was logical. Montgomery's eastern route along the coastal road was the most direct path to Messina. Patton would support, contain, and follow. Patton looked at the map differently. When Allied forces went ashore on July 10th, Montgomery's eastern thrust almost immediately stalled. The ground around Mount Etna and the port city of Catania was narrow, defensible, and ferociously held. German defenders funneled every available unit into the eastern corridor because that was where they expected the decisive blow to fall. The center and west of the island were comparatively thin. The roads leading northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital, ran through terrain that the enemy had judged secondary and unimportant. On July 17th, Patton obtained authorization from Army Group Commander General Alexander to push northwest, still nominally a support mission, still technically within his assigned role. He sent Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division and Keyes' 2nd Armored Division sweeping across open ground toward Palermo. The columns moved fast, covering roughly 100 miles in under a week. By July 22nd, Palermo had fallen, and more than 50,000 prisoners had been taken at a cost of fewer than 300 American casualties. That speed was not recklessness. It was arithmetic. A thin defense combined with armored momentum across open terrain collapses before a response can be organized. Patton converted Palermo into a supply hub and redirected his entire army east along Highway 113, the northern coastal road. With Montgomery still grinding through the bottleneck below Etna, Patton had become the main Allied effort driving toward Messina. He used amphibious landings to leapfrog German rear guards along the coast, though not without cost. One landing near Brolo resulted in significant casualties when the main advance could not link up in time, and historians have noted it as a tactical error in an otherwise aggressive campaign. U.S. 3rd Division elements entered Messina on August 17th, arriving roughly 50 minutes ahead of the first British troops. The Germans had already evacuated more than 100,000 soldiers across the strait to mainland Italy. The strategic opportunity to trap the entire garrison was not fully realized, but the operational fact was clear. Patton had taken a support army with no assigned offensive mission and turned it into the campaign's decisive force. German commanders who had written off the 7th Army as a flank guard began to recalibrate. After the war, General Gunther Blumentritt, who had helped plan Germany's invasion of France and Poland, described Patton in a study written for the U.S. Army as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. That assessment was formed, at least in part, by what happened on that island. 1 year later, the same instinct produced something larger. By late July 1944, Allied forces in Normandy had been locked in the Bocage country for nearly 2 months. The hedgerows, dense earthen walls dividing the Norman countryside into hundreds of narrow compartments, negated Allied armor and absorbed attacking units into grinding close-range attrition. German commanders held the line. The terrain was doing much of their work. Then Operation Cobra cracked the front open. On July 25th, Bradley's First Army used massed carpet bombing to blast a gap west of St. Lo, less than 5 miles wide. American infantry and armor poured through. On August 1st, Patton's Third Army became operational and surged through the Avranches bottleneck, a single road junction, barely a pinch point on any map, through which an entire army had to flow before it could spread across France. It held. The army got through. And then, Patton did something German planners had not modeled. Instead of attacking directly into the German defensive line, he moved around it. Armored columns swept briefly west into Brittany, south toward the Loire River, and most critically, east, deep behind the German southern flank, across open country that German planners assumed would never be reached so quickly. German commanders remained oriented northward, toward the Bocage, toward Caen, toward the positions they had defended all summer. Patton was already behind them. Hitler's response made it worse. On August 7th, he ordered a counterattack at Mortagne, driving west toward Avranches with the intent of cutting off Patton's breakout at its narrow base. On the surface, it was a bold counterstroke. In practice, it was a trap that deepened with every hour. By attacking west, the German armored force drove into the very pocket that was forming around it. To the south, Patton's 15th Corps was already pushing north through Alençon toward Argentan. From the north, Canadian forces were pressing south from Caen toward Falaise. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were being encircled from both directions simultaneously, their backs to the salient they had just reinforced at Mortagne. By August 12th, 15th Corps under General Hyslop had reached Argentan, just 4 kilometers from the boundary separating American and British Canadian zones. The gap between Argentan and Falaise was roughly 7 miles of road. On one side, the Canadians were driving south. On the other, Patton's forces were driving north. Approximately 200,000 German troops were inside. On the night of August 12th, Patton ordered Hyslop to push on slowly toward Falaise. What followed is one of the most debated command decisions of the entire Western campaign. On August 13th, Bradley halted the 15th Corps advance and ordered the units near Argentan to concentrate for operations in another direction. Whether that decision reflected genuine concern about overextension, coordination politics with Montgomery, or a missed chance to destroy German Army Group B entirely, historians have not reached agreement. What is clear is the result. The pocket was not immediately sealed. Tens of thousands of German troops escaped east through the gap over the following days. When Canadian and Polish forces finally closed the encirclement at Chambois on August 19th, Army Group B had lost most of its equipment and suffered catastrophic casualties. But elements had escaped. What is not debated is that the Falaise battle effectively ended organized German resistance in Normandy and opened the road to Paris. 3 months later, in December 1944, the Germans launched their last major throw in the West. Patton had been watching the Ardennes since November. His intelligence officer, Brigadier General Oskar Koch, had flagged unusual German buildups opposite the thinly held American sector, missing panzer divisions, quiet roads that should have shown traffic, a stillness that felt like preparation. By mid-November, Koch was warning of a major offensive. Patton ordered his staff to begin drafting 3 contingency plans for a rapid northward turn, quietly, before anyone outside his headquarters knew they might be needed. The attack came on December 16th. German armor drove through the Ardennes before dawn and shredded the American lines across 60 miles of front. The shock was total. Most Allied commanders were caught unprepared. Patton was not. The day before the emergency conference at Verdun, he had already assembled his staff and set the preliminary movements in motion. On December 19th, when Eisenhower asked how quickly Third Army could pivot and counterattack northward, Patton said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went quiet. Generals did not pivot entire armies in winter in 48 hours. It was not how armies moved. But the truth was more extraordinary than the famous number. The real pivot had begun before Eisenhower asked the question. Patton left the Verdun meeting at 9:15 in the morning, placed 1 phone call using a prearranged code word, and set 133,000 vehicles in motion through blizzard conditions across the roads of Belgium and Luxembourg. The logistics of the maneuver, the rerouting of supply columns, the repositioning of artillery, the reorientation of 3 divisions from an eastward axis to a northward one had been pre-planned, down to route schedules and radio frequencies. The preparation was disguised as boldness. The boldness was built entirely on preparation. The full relief of Bastogne took several days, not 48 hours. But the 4th Armored Division drove north through frozen terrain, and at 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26th, a Sherman tank named Cobra King made contact with soldiers of the 326th Engineers inside the perimeter. The 10-day siege was broken. Hitler's last offensive in the West had already begun to unravel. The corridor Patton's Third Army had driven north into the German southern flank, forced the Wehrmacht to divert elite armored divisions away from the push toward the Meuse River to contain the penetration. The road to Antwerp never opened. By mid-January 1945, the bulge had been reduced and the front largely restored. The final move came in March. The Rhine River was Germany's last natural defensive barrier in the West. Every bridge had been demolished. Field Marshal Montgomery had spent 6 months planning a massive set-piece crossing at Wesel, Operation Plunder, a coordinated assault using ground forces and airborne troops, scheduled for March 23, 1945. It was the kind of operation that matched the river's symbolic weight. Deliberate, overwhelming, impossible to miss. Patton had been watching the east bank near Oppenheim, 10 miles south of Mainz. The German 7th Army had just fallen back across the Rhine, in disorder after being driven out of the Saar-Palatinate. There had been no time to organize a coherent defense along the eastern bank. The fields near Oppenheim were thin. The Germans were watching Mainz, where any logical crossing would be prepared, because the terrain there was expected and the approach direct. On March 21st, Patton ordered a feint. The 90th Infantry Division moved toward Mainz with smoke screens and visible activity, drawing German attention north. At the same time, engineering units began quietly moving pre-positioned assault boats toward Oppenheim. The stockpile had been building since the previous autumn in rear depots in Lorraine, prepared months before anyone outside Patton's headquarters knew a crossing there was being planned. On the night of March 22, 1945, the 11th Infantry Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division pushed approximately 500 assault boats into the Rhine at Oppenheim. There was no artillery preparation, no air bombardment, no smoke screen, no airborne drop. Just boats, dark water, and silence. The first boats reached the east bank and encountered 7 German soldiers who surrendered without resistance. They appeared to be unaware that an American army was crossing. By dawn on March 23rd, the 5th Infantry had established a 6-mile-deep bridgehead on the east bank with just 20 casualties in the initial assault. Patton called Bradley that morning. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." The exchange is documented in Patton's own account. He was not being modest. He was managing the announcement. When news broke later that day, 15,000 men and 1,200 vehicles were already across, and a pontoon bridge was rising behind them. Montgomery's Operation Plunder crossed the Rhine one day later. Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to attack the Oppenheim bridgehead. His commanders told him there were no reserves available. The Rhine, the river that had defined the western boundary of German power for centuries, had been crossed in a single night, quietly, with 20 men lost in the opening assault. Third Army drove east across southern Germany through April. By the end of March alone, it had taken 300,000 prisoners. It liberated Ohrdruf and Flossenburg. It reached the Czech border by VE Day on May 8, 1945. After the war, Allied intelligence officers sat down with captured German generals and asked which Allied commander they had feared most. The answers were documented and consistent. Montgomery was methodical, they said. Predictable. You could read his timetable. Bradley was competent, but cautious. You could plan around his hesitation. Patton was different. Alfred Jodl, who had served as Hitler's chief of operations until the last day of the war, told American interrogators, he was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. General Heinz Guderian himself said, "From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him for his victory, since he acted as I should have done, had I been in his place." 5 moves. Sicily to the Rhine. From a support army no one expected to attack, to the first force across Germany's final barrier. In Sicily, Patton moved before the enemy expected a secondary army to act. In Normandy, he moved before German planners believed armor could operate beyond the bocage. At Falaise, he drove north toward a near-complete encirclement, stopped by decisions made above his command. At Bastogne, he turned an entire army 90 degrees in winter before anyone had officially ordered him to move. At Oppenheim, he crossed a river the enemy believed was defensible, with 20 men lost in the opening hours. The pattern was not luck. It was not charisma. It was not the famous helmet or the ivory-handled pistols. It was this. Patton built his plans before the enemy built theirs. He prepared for crises before they became crises. And by the time the enemy understood what was happening, the move was already complete. That was what the men on the other side of the line eventually understood. It was what they never forgot.